welcome everyone to today's Faculty Academic Staff Forum. My name is Erica Benson. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, and I have the great honor of introducing today's speaker. So Dr. Ken Pereira is a professor of voice in the Department of Music and Theater Arts here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, where he teaches applied voice, opera, and musical theater workshop, diction for singers, and musical theater history. He directs operas and musicals for the University Theater's main stage season as well, with recent productions including Don Giovanni, Company, Orpheus in the Underworld, Guys and Dolls, and Cinderella. As a professional baritone, he has performed in opera, recitals, and orchestral concerts across North America and Europe. So before I turn things over to Dr. Pereira, I'll note that we will have some time for questions. So please be thinking about your questions and your comments. And for our viewers on Zoom, I want to encourage you to enter your questions and comments in the Q&A using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And our wonderful graduate assistant, Ethan, will read those aloud for us. And Dr. Pereira, I'll just ask you if we get any questions from the audience, if you could just do a brief recap.
Absolutely.
For the benefit of our online viewers. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Pereira.
Thank you all so much, and for those of you on Zoom for being here today. It's fun for me to get to share maybe a different side of the creative scholarly work we do in academia. I was looking at the other titles of the forum. I'm like, well, this is something different. But I think no less important. I think this work also is important. Hopefully, as I talk about the decisions that went into this production in particular, you'll see why. You go and see a show, and you go and hopefully you have a good time, and you see like this spectacle before your eyes. And I always like to describe it as, well, that's the tip of the iceberg. Everything else, all the thought and research and all these things that went into it is all submerged. And hopefully coming through that it's a well thought out, executed piece, but there's often a lot more that doesn't even hit the stage, but that informed all those decisions going to the stage. So I wanted to just walk you through a bit of the process from the beginning of when we start to discuss, oh, we're doing an opera, or we're doing a musical, or we're doing a play, just so you can also get to know the big sense of collaboration from many different areas. I feel both equally blessed and cursed that I do a lot of work in opera, because it is kind of where all the arts collide. And it's really exciting. But it's also a lot. It's big. It's a lot. So even when you're doing a smaller piece, it ends up being a lot. But just want to talk a little bit about that process of selecting a title. I don't just get to walk in and say, this is the opera we are doing. Far from it. I often have to prepare a list of several operas, which I researched. We just went through this recently for next year. And I think I had about 15 titles on that piece that I have to be prepared to talk about in terms of, this is what the concept would be, this is what the various parameters, requirements would be in terms of sets, costumes, what location or space we would use, what are the requirements for the orchestra, do we even have, do we have the singers in the program, the singing actors in the program to pull this off, which is a unique challenge when you're talking an all undergraduate program. And so it's a lot about, you're trying to weigh the practical versus the artistic side of things. And I will say the practical always wins out. It always wins out. And then the unique challenge is finding a way to make that artistic. So it's a challenge I've learned I've really enjoyed over the years. I kind of like the restrictions and the barriers, believe it or not, all those things, because I find that's where we get to become more creative, and really where the research can really serve us in thinking about things in a new way from how maybe it's always been done. And also when we're talking about a show, we're not just talking about one show, we're talking about 4 different titles for a season. and making sure that those are balanced in terms of the demands we're making upon the various departments in terms of sets and lighting and costumes. You know, Cendrillon or Cinderella was a period show. As you can imagine, if we're putting everyone in Edwardian clothing, and I think there were like 14, 16 new frocks made for this, you know, built for this show. Actually more, I think, maybe more closer to 20. Maybe the next show in the season has to be something modern dress, you know, that we make sure we're using our resources wisely and not burning anyone out in the process. So I'm always on the research for titles, for potential titles for shows. And this was a piece I had started hearing coming up more and more. I hear more people talking about, oh, we're doing Cendrillon. I'm like, the Massenet, that's huge. Like, no, it's Viardot's. Pauline Viardot's Cendrillon. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take a listen to that. And so I started listening to it, and I thought, well, this is pretty. It's beautiful. It's short, you know. And it's just done with piano. And I thought, well, that's curious. Why was it never orchestrated? So you go look into that. And then I found out the performance history behind the piece. It was actually a piece she composed for her own voice students. More on Viardot later. I just want to do like a whole class on her someday. Because through this process, I just like fell in love with her. But she wrote this piece for her voice students in order to learn how to do and how to perform opera. Well, how perfect is that for an academic setting? And she and her husband and her lover used to host a weekly salon in Paris. And that's where this opera was first presented, was actually in her home as part of this, her salon. Every Thursday evening, they had a salon. They had a more informal one on Sunday for just close friends. But, and I'll talk a bit more about some of the people you would have seen at her salons. It's quite fascinating, everyone who she knew and who was in her circle of influence. So again, I think about it and I like, well, that's an interesting option. Let me look at these other 15 pieces over here. And then you never know where inspiration is going to come from, because at the same time with this, you know, right when you're about done doing whatever opera you're doing, and you're in the final stages of 14-hour days of teaching all day and then rehearsals at night, things like that, people start saying, so what's next? And you're already having to start thinking about it. Well, we had just done at the end of 2023, we did Orpheus in the Underworld. It was our first big show coming back out of the pandemic. It was the one and only time I cast everyone who auditioned and made sure everyone found a place in the show. And it was huge, and I was tired. And I thought, it'd be really nice to do something smaller next time. So I was already thinking about what can we do that's smaller. Plus, with that, we have a growing musical theater program. I thought it'd be really great for those students to get a chance at being at the big stage. You know, since we have the RCU theater once every, or twice every 4 years. So all those things started leading me to think about smaller titles, and Cendrillon just kept popping back up. So this would have been fall of, before Orpheus in the Underworld, though, I'm already starting to think about other titles for the next thing. I went to see a production we were doing of The Bald Soprano in Riverside Theater over in Haas. And it was just a living room set. And I thought, this is interesting. And in my head, it was like, I was thinking about the salon and thinking about that environment. So already then drawing inspiration from my other colleagues' productions, Jennifer Chapman directed that production, Aaron Heisey designed the set. I started thinking about, well, what could we do in this space? And start conceiving of things for that. Ultimately, the Cendrillon was what was selected. And we were going to do it in Riverside. And the piece, and part of my agreement was that we would not have to pay for any rights for this piece. It would be a piece that was completely free, which is great. It's possible. Viardot's been gone for a while, so she's not under, you know, copyright laws. However, the whole piece is in French. Now, while I was confident I could help the students be able to sing in French, for the opera, French dialogue's a whole different story. So I thought, well, that would make a great summer research project, which we did. We turned it into a summer research project with students. We translated the original French script and made our own script in English, and also started to create this world. And you're thinking about the story of Cinderella. It's a fairy tale. There's magic. As much as I love the piano, on its own, just listening to it, it doesn't quite bring the same sense of magic a full orchestra does in terms of colors. And so I knew, like, well, just doing it straight on is like we're just doing Cinderella. It wasn't going to have, to me, the same kind of magic if that's the expectation. So what else can we do that brings this idea of just having piano as the orchestration into the world? And then again, I was thinking back on that production of Bald Soprano that I saw and how cozy it felt sitting in this space like you're looking in on a living room. And I thought, well, what if we do our best to do a dramatized version of the original production of Cendrillon? What if we recreate the French Salon and invite our audience into that world, to go back to 1904 Paris, and it's like you were there when the piece was premiered. Another great place to jump off for research for these students to learn about how to build that world. So that's what we started to study, and we started to study Viardot. So what I have here is essentially my director's presentation that I presented to the production team on our very first production meeting, showing the research I had, and just so to clue you into what my thought process was as we were entering into all of this. I will try to do this. I do opera, so it's about as low tech as you get. There we go. Okay, the first thing, okay. So as when I kept looking to the opera, it's like, yeah, Cinderella is great, but Viardot, she is cool. She is so cool. She was a famous singer, pianist, composer. She was fluent in like 7 languages. Yeah, like I said, at her social circle, these are people who came regularly to her salon. Victor Hugo, Georges Sand was a close friend. Charles Dickens. It is said, I love this story, and I'll tell you where I learned a lot of these stories. In London, Viardot was singing her favorite role, Norma, from Bellini's opera Norma. And Georges Sand came back to her in her dressing room, and with her hands, she said, "These are the tears of Charles Dickens." He was so moved by Viardot's performance, he just sobbed uncontrollably into Georges Sand's hands. Alfred de Musset, Robert and Clara Schumann, Johannes Brahms, Charles Gounod, the famous French composer. She was the influencer of her time musically. Charles Gounod only got an opera premiered at the Paris Opera because she agreed to come out of retirement and sing the lead role. His opera Sappho. Frederick Chopin, naturally his friend, she did many settings of his mazurkas for voice, actually. She wrote a vocal line in, and they're fun. Ivan Turgenev was her lover, famous Russian author. But there were so many composers, Saint-Saëns, Berlioz, Fauré, Massenet, Gounod, these famous French composers, if you know that world. Their music was all introduced to Paris through her salon. If you know Saint-Saëns, The Carnival of the Animals, first performance in her salon. We don't hear enough about Viardot. So now part of it's my mission in life, I think, to like let her name be known, because again, she was the influencer of the time. Her stamp of approval meant something. She herself was the daughter of Manuel Garcia the Elder, who was a famous tenor, actually created the role of Count Almaviva in the Barber of Seville by Rossini. The little serenade that is typically performed with guitar in that opera was actually not written by Rossini. It was written by her father, Garcia. And he played on the guitar to perform it, but even though Rossini got the credit for it. Her family, through her father, he had his own opera company. He came to the US and with his wife and her older sister, who was a very famous singer, Maria Malibran, and her older brother, Manuel Garcia II, who went on to become a very famous vocal pedagogue, came and performed the first performances in the US of Mozart's Don Giovanni. So at 4 years old, Pauline Viardot is sitting on the knee of Lorenzo da Ponte, because by this point he had immigrated to the United States and was teaching Italian at Columbia University. Lorenzo da Ponte was the librettist for Mozart in Don Giovanni, in The Marriage of Figaro, and Così fan tutte. Another fascinating figure if you want to have a fun romp through history reading about him. And I'll just say this, so we have this connection back to the music of Mozart, Rossini, and all these composers that she knew. At the end of her life, she was corresponding with Stravinsky. So her span of influence in the classical Western musical world is huge. And I just think her name should be better known. So that's why I'm spending a lot of time. So I started to get really fascinated in her. So these are these different rabbit holes you go down. So yeah, and she was also, at one point she had to flee France because of her politics weren't so liked. And then she eventually came back and took a job at the conservatory teaching voice, and had her salons as well. When she left Paris, she went for a while to Baden-Baden and had a salon there. And there's nobility who came to that. That's where she met the Schumanns. That's where she also met Brahms. They would come to her weekly salons as well. So all these names we hear, it's so fun to hear about them all being together in a room discussing philosophy and life and performing music and introducing new composers to the scene. And so that's a bit of like where I was like, I want to feel that. Cinderella's great. We love Cinderella. But can we create that environment of the salon? So that's what we strove to do. So talking about the world of the operetta, we decided to set it, and this again, you listen to your colleagues, especially colleagues who are going to be doing a lot of work. Amanda Profeser, our wonderful costume designer, said, I've never gotten to design an Edwardian period show. I'd really like to do an Edwardian period show. You know what we should do sometime is an Edwardian period show. I went, well, Amanda, here's your chance. Because that's where we were here. So turn of the century Paris. And this is where I started taking some liberties. I believe the opera was premiered in April of 1904. And I thought, well, we're doing the show. We knew it was in the second slot in December. I didn't want to do a Christmas show. But I thought, well, what else could we do? Make it feel wintry, cozy. I thought, well, midnight's kind of important in Cinderella. It's also important at New Year's Eve. What if we make this like a New Year's Eve party? And at the stroke of 12, when others are celebrating, we have that coincide with the story. So just trying to find ways of our play in a play we have going on, weaving these little tidbits in. And yes, we decided to do, this is a lot of a Parisian apartment on the Boulevard Saint-Germain in Paris, which is in fact where her apartment was. It's at the very end. I have a picture later because I was in Paris studying French for this production to teach all the French. And while I was there working on other stuff. And I got to, well, there'll be more on that later, but I got to go see at least the outside. It's a law office now, so I wasn't going to go bother them. But looking out on the Place de Concorde was her apartment at the end of Saint-Germain. So So then, yeah, delving more, a lot of our research, the first part of our summer research project, and just in what I was studying was studying what is a Parisian salon? What were the components of it? How do we bring this to life? And this picture actually was a drawing taken from one of Viardot's salons. That's why I included it here. So you get the idea of the audience gathered around. We did not have a big pipe organ in our production. Would have been fun, but we needed the space for dancing. We did have a big chandelier. But it's fun to kind of look at these pictures and see this world that they were inspired by in these creations. So we decided to make the whole evening. Yes, we're doing Cendrillon. We're doing this little operetta, but really we're doing it presenting a salon evening. So in the salon, through the research, we found the whole evening revolved around a single question or idea to be answered or explored throughout the course of the evening. So we had to look at Cinderella, and we were coming up with different questions. This was work we did with the students, like what is the question this piece is answering? And ultimately we settled around like something like what makes us worthy of love. You know, we took an idea like that, something that we could give a very nebulous French, like I'm not going to tell you the answer by the end of the production, but it was fun to explore that with them. They were so concrete in their thinking. I was like, no, we can broaden this out. How are we looking at this? And then the idea of the salon is throughout the course of the evening, you have all these people of different disciplines, and they'd be looking at it from all these different points of view. And music and games were also part of the experience, which we did put into our show as well. So there were things, we found different accounts, some through a book one of Viardot's daughters wrote. Louise Viardot had written a book, and it described some of these salons and different things, some different articles we found, which were fascinating. So we tried to weave some of those ideas into it. One, I'll talk a bit more and show some pictures about too. They used to play a game. And one thing too, is you're studying about Viardot and her husband, Louis Viardot, and they were avid art collectors. They bought art from all over and all had these things displayed in their home. And one thing they would do at parties, and I'd like to think this was after a few glasses of champagne, is they would look at a portrait and make up the most outrageous story about the subject of the portrait. And then so part of me was thinking, well, how do we work that in? You know, do we just grab a portrait and make something up? And then I had the idea of like, well, what if we modify it a little bit? Again, take some creative license, and we just have an empty portrait frame and hold it up to people in the audience. And so we did that and had some benign but fun joking with our audience, like, "Oh, two lovers together." It didn't matter which two people were in the photo. we're in the picture frame. They were called out for their illicit affair they were having, and things like that. You know, which also led to the choice. I really wanted the audience to feel like they were part of the experience, not that they were viewing, but they were in the salon. So we actually staged a whole half-hour pre-show that as the audience was being seated, the cast was starting to come in, the maids were getting things ready, the butler kept falling asleep, all these things. And little by little, the cast would start interacting with the audience. They were up in that space in Riverside, welcoming them. We went over maybe like 5 common French phrases. You could say, you know, bonsoir, comment ça va, you know. Sometimes someone would answer them in a lot more French than they understood, and that was always very humorous. But we wanted the audience to feel like they were part of the experience. And so also when they come out and everyone starts singing in French, it was a little less shocking. And I think that was one of the successes of the production. My parents are still trying to figure out how they ended up with an opera singer for a son. My dad likes 2 kinds of music, country and Western, and my mom loves Pink. And then they got me, who's like, Verdi. And they said, we didn't even notice it was in French when they were singing. We just, felt like we're just following the story and enjoying. We also felt part of it because people were talking to them. The cast had broken down that wall, so I think that was a successful aspect. And I think by and large the audience has bought in to the idea. Also helps that we pretty much all know the story of Cinderella, so it could be in Swahili and we would still get it. So again, just now talking about some things with the set, I've described some of these things, but this is what I come into with the production team, saying these are things I would like to see. It's a unit set, one set, a living room in a Grand Parisian apartment. I knew I wanted some exits to balconies that were seen. Of course, then you start get grumbling from the TD about there being doors. But I will say our set designer had a very creative solution. I said the piano is going to be on stage, so there needs to be space for a grand piano because that's our orchestra. There's no pit in Riverside Theater, so it was going to feel like it was in the room. And again, like I was saying, the line between the stage and the audience should be blurred, should feel immersive. So I needed access for the performers to be able to go out into the house easily and not for there to feel like such a separation. Then when you're coming up with these presentations, you're trying to touch on every area to give some direction, some sort of insight to how you're viewing the world of this production. So finally, I said, we're in Paris, it's the city of lights. Yeah, we were looking at like what kind of light was happening in 1904 in Paris, doing that sort of research as well. I said it's interior, but it's nighttime. And I said I didn't want it to feel theatrical. I just wanted it to feel very cozy and warm. Talk about the pre-show in this. I said, yes, at midnight, I'd like for it to seem like there are fireworks off stage. Mm. So, and then we, of course, our wonderful lighting and set designer, Professor Aaron Heisey, figured it out. So I'm so grateful to have such a wonderful group of colleagues who are wonderfully creative in their various disciplines. And you try to provide pictures and things. Just again, we're trying to evoke a mood, a feeling of what we want the production to be. Costumes. Yeah, so Amanda got her wish. It was all Edwardian era. And this was another, I will say, another little liberty we took in coming up with the script. In the script and in the pre-show, we were saying there was like a different singer, a different voice student of our main character, who was quasi Pauline Viardot, but not really, but inspired by Viardot, who was going to play Cendrillon, but she was sick. And we also, in the pre-show, was really fun. They had fun starting a rumor. She had gotten pregnant by the tenor. She had all these different things. There was a reason why she wasn't there that night. But in secret, one of the maids had been studying voice with Madame, as we called her. And that character ended up playing Cendrillon in the performance. Rather last minute, she was selected in our staging to do it. So I had to talk about, like, there's a costume change. She's going to be in a maid outfit, then she's going to appear in a gown and things like that. So this is where you help clue your colleagues into all these things that you're going to need. And of course, there's more questions as you go along. Yeah. We also had a lot of guest artists, musicians. One of the fun parts about this show is there's a little concert in the ball scene that you get to program. And again, this is where the research affected some choices that were made. We all picked all musicians or all pieces of music that either were important to Viardot's own singing career or her family, or of composers she had introduced to the Parisian audiences. She owned, here's another, my Viardot nerddom coming out again. She owned the original manuscript of Mozart's Don Giovanni. She had it. Tchaikovsky made a pilgrimage from Russia to come see it. So we had a duet from Don Giovanni. We also had a piece of Tchaikovsky's, to also celebrate that part of her life with her lover Turgenev. We used music by Fauré. Fauré was engaged at one point to her oldest daughter, and she broke up with him. And that's how we got the Fauré Requiem. He composed the Mass for the Dead based on his failed relationship with her daughter. I mean, it's really cool how she's really at the epicenter of all of this world. And other pieces. We had a duet by Brahms. She was friends. We had a big dance fun sequence of a clarinet piece by Rossini, the theme and variations for clarinet and orchestra we did with piano. Partly also with that, I wanted to feature some other music making that happens in the Department of Music and Theater Arts that doesn't often get the big stage. In the pre-show, we had some piano duos as well. It was like she had some piano students that forgot their lesson was canceled. So we had some little music in there, but there's a lot of wonderful music making that happens in the department, and not all these things always get their own concert, but we were trying to find ways of working them into this production. So yes, things about costumes, trying to be mindful of the time. Talking a bit about the ensemble, everyone was always on stage in this show. Very rarely did people leave the stage. So we were talking about, well, are they all party goers, or some people could be maids, footmen, etc. We did double cast this show, so every role had two people, but on the night they were not their principal role, they were then in the ensemble. So they were still always there, just to provide more opportunities and help share the vocal load, because singing this opera is not all these students are doing during this period of time. They have lots of other singing obligations and classes, so we're always trying to preserve their vocal health as they're developing as well. Our maid costumes ended up pretty close to that. Props. Yes, there were a lot of props in the show. I really put out the signal that I wanted some sort of old gramophone. I got it. I was excited. But yeah, talking about filling this apartment with things of the period and having then the opera props that appear in their performance appear more homemade, versus more realistic things like when they have glassware and things like that. Again, trying to give each member of the production team an idea or a direction to head off in. And then finally, we get some photos. Other photos I just found inspiring. The picture on the right is actually her apartment. So if you look up to that, well, for us, be the third story with a little balcony, that was her apartment. So yeah, and that leads me now to some pictures from the production. So this is what the production team saw in the very first meeting, and now you'll see what we came up with, and I'll describe some things going on here. So this is the opening scene. As you see, the whole cast gathered around in the salon, kind of semicircle. I mentioned before the TD grumbling about doors, and Erin, our set designer, having a very creative solution. She took, I think the next picture is about the portrait game I was talking about earlier, and she decided to make a whole wall of frames. So it wasn't quite realistic, but it still helped tell our story. Gives the idea, gave the feeling you were in this home that had a lot of art, but rather than being filled with different paintings, we had this beautiful backdrop they had done of Paris and the Eiffel Tower, things like that. And as you can see, lots of big dresses. And the piano, the conductor, were all brought in as part of the show. They all had to act, which was fun for them. I'd like to think it was fun for them. So again, our modified picture, portrait game. We had this. I found a frame somewhere at some sale for $5, and they covered it in gold leaf. And we held that up to members of the audience as well as cast members. But again, this is kind of all the beginning of the show before the actual opera starts. Oh, this was fun. You know, in Cinderella, you had to figure out how to do the pumpkin carriage and all those things, and how mice were turned into horses and things like that. So that was all very cleverly, I thought, staged and choreographed with help of SK Stone, our dance faculty, and how we changed people into things. And you can't see it, but Cendrillon is sitting on a very round orange poof. So that was our pumpkin. And the parasols became our carriage wheels and things like that in the space. So our Madame, the lady kind of on the little stage there, she was our fairy godmother as well, but we kind of made her the Viardot character. An interesting thing about the Parisian Salon, it was a very female-driven event. It was always a woman at the head of it, the hostess of the salon. So we felt it was appropriate to have that character kind of at the core of everything. She made all the choices. And, you know, we're thinking, well, do you make her Cendrillon? I thought, no, I think you make her the fairy godmother. Kind of, you know, the puppeteer of this whole thing. And this was a piece we had added. This is the end. We added an aria for her, actually by Gounod, Je veux vivre, from Gounod's Romeo and Juliet. So it's one of Juliet's big showpiece arias, and so we did that, and they all waltzed to it. It's actually called Juliet's Waltz Song in the score. This was in a very silly moment. We had this long dance sequence of this Rossini piece I had mentioned earlier. You can see our clarinetist, wonderful Michaela Guzman on stage, clarinet performance major, studies with Dr. Ali Powell in the department. Just came in and knocked the socks off this piece every night. It was always just a highlight, but it was fun to come up with a concept for an 11-minute clarinet piece and keep everyone, the audience, entertained. What we thought could be interesting was, since it's theme and variations, it was Count Barigoul, who's actually the prince's valet, but he was pretending to be the prince in this version of Cinderella, would use each variation to dance with a different prospective lady at the ball, which eventually just became a swarm of bel canto, buffo, opera, comic hijinks. So here he's finally running away from everyone. He's ended up on a table, and as you can see, there's all sorts of interesting pairings going on. Just everyone grabs someone. But it was also just a little nod to Rossini and the importance of Rossini and Viardot's own performing career and his kind of the crazy comic operas that Rossini wrote. Of course, this is the moment at midnight, and you have the prince and Cinderella and the kiss and all that, but I just thought it was a beautiful moment in the piece and really highlighting the lighting work and the set design of Aaron Heisey on faculty here. The thing is, I've learned as a director, is you can have ideas, but the other people in the room's ideas are going to be so much better. And it's like I tell the students, my job as a director is to be an editor. I'm not the content creator. They're bringing things to the table, like the designers bring things to the table, and I just try to make sure we're editing and all telling the same story, that we're telling the story we want to tell. It's not my job to tell every person what to do. I mean, it is, but I want to see their ideas come forth, and then I'm just helping guide them to make sure we're all telling the same story. But every time I think of something, like, oh, that could be a cool idea, and I bring it to my design colleagues, they make it so much better. They make it so much better. It's one of the things I love is the collaboration and how we all come together to tell these stories and put on these productions. There's our orange poof. You can see it came back. The shoe, because you can't talk about Cinderella without talking about the shoe. It wasn't a glass slipper. You know, we thought we'll just want a really fancy shoe, which Amanda Proface, the costume designer, really appreciated. And then finally, I just put one up at the final tableau, you can see a bit of our chandelier more in that picture. yeah, but I think ultimately all the research really helped inform the choices. And it created a more interesting retelling of Cinderella, and also got to highlight some of the other work we do in the department in terms of music making, and it served the students. Again, it was a piece written to teach students how to do opera. They all got a chance now, which is very rare in undergrad, to say, I learned a role in a foreign language before they go off to grad school, and they've been through that process. But it was an appropriate level of challenge, for the group that we had. And I'm excited. I think this work that I've done will have more of a life. I've been approached by a production company based out of Cincinnati who want to put together a production of this to tour to different venues and recreating the salon. But now my challenge is I have to write an English singing translation. So that's my next summer project. And my next project I'm looking at doing is creating the singing translation. And then, yes, hopefully on my sabbatical, if I get it and all the timing lines up, I'll be going to direct a touring production. So, thank you. Any questions?
Your last sentence set me up. This is what I've been thinking about broadly. A lot of smaller opera companies are doing more operas in English to thinking about accessibility and trying to bring in new audiences.
Yeah.
And as an educator, thinking about where to sort of like preparing students for maybe one day singing at the Met, maybe one day singing at, a local, like, how do you think about balancing operas in their original language versus operas translated into English, or as you did here, like a script in English with songs in French? Like, how do you think?
I always look at the group of students I have in front of me, and I go, what's the appropriate level of challenge for them? What's going to help them grow further? In this case, with this cast, most of this cast were first and second year students. Most. But then I had some older seniors who were getting ready to leave for grad school. So it's like, how do you, like I'm doing the 6-7 thing, how do you serve those seniors and give them the experience, of like really, because they're going to approach roles in foreign languages, but not have the other rest of the cast drown in that experience. And this is where this piece really served all the things. There were a couple major parts that, like, okay, this is like really going to serve these older, more experienced students. And then some parts where they were maybe just a couple numbers, and over the course of a semester they could get those learned and do it pretty well, but it was enough. For them. And then we could also in the concert portion tailor that to the people we had and making sure we were meeting them where they are, and again just trying to get them to stretch a little further. But like our next big opera will be in English, so because it's a whole other just skill set to coordinate with that too. So it's always, we're also addressing it through what we select for scenes, performances, and things like that. I'm trying to make sure everyone's left here having learned how to do Mozart recitative in some way, shape, or form. When we did Don Giovanni back in 2019, that was an exceptional group of students. One of the Don Giovannis is making his Met debut next season. So, that was a really different group of students. So that was the appropriate piece then. But I think it's always about seeing who's in front of you. And like I said, it's always more the practical that wins out. And then our task is to make it artistic.